This video was brought to you by Brilliant. On Wednesday, Peru's Prime Minister Aníbal Torres dramatically and suddenly resigned. And while we wouldn't normally dedicate a full video to the resignation of Peru's Prime Minister, Torres' resignation is pretty major. And that's because Peru's president, Pedro Castillo, will now have to name his fifth Prime Minister since taking office just over a year ago last July. So in this video, we'll be asking just what's causing Peru to get through so many prime ministers so quickly, and what might be next for the South American country. So let's get into it. To properly understand the current political turmoil, we'll need to turn back the clock slightly to the start of Castillo's presidency. Pedro Castillo's journey to the presidency wasn't exactly a typical one. As a former rural schoolteacher, he had no links to the country's traditional political or economic elite, with him first coming to prominence after leading a successful teachers' strike over pay in 2017. 4 years later, in 2021, with strong support from more rural and poorer Peruvians, he narrowly beat the daughter of Peru's former dictatorial president by just 44,000 votes to become president himself. Having stood as the candidate for Free Peru, a Marxist-Leninist party, his election risked spooky investors and the international community alike. And while Castillo has successfully managed to reassure the markets by appointing a technocrat to manage the economy, both his pick of prime ministers and his personal status have dragged the country down slightly. Let's start with prime ministers, and initially, things looked okay. After taking office, Castillo appointed Guido Bellido as his first prime minister, with the wider cabinet composed of experienced politicians from multiple parties. However, in October, after a mini cabinet reshuffle, Castillo requested Bellido's resignation, after Bellido threatened to nationalize oil resources in the country. Castillo then appointed Mirtha Vázquez, a former interim president of Peru's Congress. However, after Castillo suffered a wave of ministerial resignations due to everything from hosting a party during the peak of infections to corruption in the police force, Vázquez resigned, citing the, quote, impossibility of reaching a consensus to benefit the country. Castillo then appointed his third prime minister in just 8 months, Mr. Héctor Balear. Unfortunately for Castillo, though, the appointment of Balear sparked a huge wave of protests amid allegations of domestic violence against his daughter and late wife, and he was quickly fired. Which brings us onto Castillo's fourth appointment, Aníbal Torres, who announced his resignation on Wednesday, citing personal reasons, which means that Castillo will have to find yet another prime minister. This isn't Castillo's only problem either. In March of this year, Peru's Congress approved the initiation of impeachment proceedings against Castillo over allegations of corruption, which Castillo describes as a coup. In any case, Castillo avoided impeachment, with 55 legislators voting to impeach, below the required 87 for impeachment. Then, in late May, Peruvian prosecutors announced that a criminal investigation into the former Minister of Transport and Communications would be expanded to cover the president himself, looking into corruption and, quote, the commission of crimes of criminal organizations. Now, this made Castillo the first president to be subject to a criminal investigation during their time in office. But technically speaking, under Article 117 of Peru's constitution, a president cannot be sentenced for common crimes during his time in office, the exception being crimes like treason, preventing the functioning of Congress, and preventing elections. To add to these two active investigations, in July, the national prosecutor opened a further 3 cases, 2 concerning the awarding of public contracts, and 1 about irregular promotions, before opening yet another one alleging obstruction of justice, after Castillo removed the interior minister who'd created a dedicated team to find allies of the president involved in one of the public contract cases. Now, to be fair to President Castillo, the current political crisis isn't entirely his fault. His opponents had fought hard to remove him from office, and it was weeks after the election before he was even declared as the winner, due to multiple baseless allegations of electoral fraud from his right-wing opponent. And he's also faced a Congress dominated by opposition parties. Now, political chaos in Peru isn't something unique to Castillo's term in office. After all, he's the country's fifth president since 2018. And 3 of his 4 predecessors in that short period of time either resigned or were impeached. So if Castillo is indeed forced out of office before the end of his term in 2026, then it certainly wouldn't be unusual. In any case, the problems for Castillo's government haven't been limited to within Congress. In March 2022, mass protests broke out amid soaring prices for food, fuel, fertilizer, and the cost of living more generally. And in early April, Castillo's government attempted to mitigate rising prices by suspending taxes on most fuel and raising the minimum wage by about 10%, although this did little to quell the unrest. Then, late at night on the 4th of April, Castillo announced a total curfew for the following day in the capital of Lima, which spurred more anger from the opposition and from protesters. And he was subsequently forced to cut the curfew short just after 5 p.m. Protesters and police clashed throughout weeks of protests, and an estimated 8 people died. Now, while the worst of this unrest seems to have settled down, the government still faces protests and strikes as inflation-related problems persist. So clearly this resignation comes at a bad time for Peru and its president, and former political and social volatility looks increasingly inevitable as the country struggles to find any leader who can stick out the full term. All in all then, when watching this political chaos and wrangling for power, you might start to believe that the decisions made by countries and leaders are at random and without any real purpose. However, if you'd like to be more logical in your decision making, then you should check out my favorite course on Brilliant. Their logical thinking course might start simple, but it builds, teaching you logical reasoning skills until you're solving problems which previously looked impossible. And you'll get used to that empowering feeling of learning, because Brilliant's not just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. Using this teaching methodology, you can learn about all kinds of STEM topics. That's algebra, applied probability, calculus, gravitational physics, and even cryptocurrency. In fact, they even have a new course from Kurzgesagt, which I have to say, I found very personally exciting and spent a lot of time playing with. Anyway, if you want to learn in a more fun way, then you should sign up to Brilliant. And the link in the description will get you 20% off an annual premium subscription, which is not only a great deal, but also supports the channel. So, thank you.